Do you believe that if you stopped appearing on television in a mask, if your face was to be exposed now on this program, that your life would be in danger?
Oh yes, definitely.
Mr. Gouzenko, are you suggesting that Soviet intelligence, in all the time that it's had since you defected, has not been able to trace you down, that they don't know exactly where you are and what you look like and where you live and what name you travel under and what your wife looks like and what your children look like and where they go to school and, in fact, every detail of your life?
Well, I assume they know. That's why I'm 100 times even more careful. I assume it.
I take pride in the word Ich bin ein Berliner.
It was an unusually warm night on September 5th, 1945, when a thin, frantic Russian man barged into the office of the Ottawa Journal, a local newspaper in Canada's capital city. He carried with him some 109 secret documents he had stolen from the Soviet embassy and showed them to the night editor, Chester Froude. Because of the man's distressful state and thick accent, Froude struggled to understand what he was saying, except for a few words that the Russian repeated over and over again. "It's war, it's Russia," he said. After a while, Froude had lost his patience and told the man to go to the nearby RCMP station, but the man refused, as he worried that Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had already infiltrated the RCMP. The Russian man left promptly and decided to head for the Department of Justice instead, but the building was closed. With his options exhausted for the time being, he returned to his apartment for the night and came back the next day demanding to speak with the Minister of Justice, Louis Saint Laurent. But who was this mysterious Russian man? How did he come in possession of those secret Soviet documents? And why was he in such a hurry to speak with the Justice Minister? His name was Igor Gouzenko, and he was a man on borrowed time that was quickly running out. Gouzenko was born in 1919 in the town of Rogachev, in modern-day Belarus. He never knew his father, who disappeared during the Russian Civil War. His mother was a highly educated schoolteacher, but struggled to make ends meet. Despite this early hardship, Gouzenko was an extraordinary student who was tremendously intelligent and artistically gifted. He went on to attend the Moscow Architectural Institute, where he met his wife, Svetlana Guseva, or just Anna, as Gouzenko called her. As he recalled, she was a tall, beautiful brunette and an honor student from a much wealthier family. It was love at first sight, and soon they were married. They were going to finish their studies and presumably become accomplished members of Soviet society, but that plan was permanently put on hold when the Second World War began. Fortunately, Gouzenko was not sent to the front lines. He was handpicked by the NKVD to attend the Military Engineering Academy, then the Higher Intelligence School of the Red Army, before he was finally made a cipher clerk with the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. Gouzenko was sent to a posting in Ottawa in 1943. He was accompanied by his superior, Colonel Nikolai Zabotin, and Zabotin's assistant, Major Alexander Romanov. Anna, who was now pregnant, would arrive a few months later. Upon arrival, the trio stayed at the luxurious Hotel Chateau Laurier while awaiting their permanent living quarters. There, they were understandably left in awe by the incomprehensibly more attractive life in Ottawa. The comfort, convenience, and freedom were something Gouzenko had never experienced before in his life. Of course, Gouzenko and Colonel Zabotin did not arrive simply as harmless tourists, or even diplomats for that matter. In reality, Colonel Zabotin, codenamed Grant, was there to take over as head of the spy ring the Soviets had set up long before his arrival. By 1943, the ever paranoid Joseph Stalin was already thinking the Western Allies would turn on the Soviet Union once war with Nazi Germany ended. Thus, the Soviets had hoped to take advantage of Canada's weak counterintelligence capabilities and extract sensitive information on the British and Americans. Indeed, according to one Soviet report, a false Canadian identity document and passport could enable spies to cross from Canada to the United States without much difficulty and to remain indefinitely in the United States without much molestation. Canada also proved a welcoming destination for the Soviets, as pre-war anti-communism had been set aside for their united fronts against Germany. Soviet diplomats were thus highly popular at this time, even though they were secretly spying on Canada. They threw parties and attended hunting trips, deeply embedding themselves within affluent Canadian society. It was from this demographic that GRU agents pretending to be diplomats had the most recruitment success, especially with young, well-educated intellectuals who romanticized communist ideals. These intellectuals, many of whom were also civil servants, helped the GRU to establish a foothold in Ottawa's government and diplomatic circles, where they collected information and sent it back to the Soviet Union. In the testimony of one Gordon Lunin, who was a captain in the Canadian Armed Forces and spent 5 years in prison for cooperating with the GRU spy ring, he laid out the common mindset many of his peers shared at the time. He said the following: "I admire the Soviet Union for what I believed then to be its enlightened worldview. I wished it well, but like most of my other comrades, I suspect I would not have wanted to live there or to make Canada over in its likeness. RCMP claims to the contrary notwithstanding. The real glue that bound me to my comrades and them to me was the shared desire for a more humane society, a fairer distribution of wealth. It is clear that for many of those turned by the Soviets, they did not consider themselves traitors, as they thought they were simply helping an ally in their common fight against Nazism. Whether or not that is a fair justification is a matter that is considerably less clear." In addition to the GRU, the NKVD was also active in Canada, though they were less effective. The GRU had already established networks of informants, while the NKVD was spread much thinner, having also been responsible for embassy security, and being the target of Stalin's purges in the years prior, wiped out most of its experienced leadership and members. Despite the nature of his occupation, Gouzenko and Anna could not have been happier with their lives in Ottawa. Soon after Anna's arrival, the couple welcomed their first child, a son they named Andrei. To Gouzenko, life in the Soviet Union was a living hell compared to his new life in Canada, on which he wrote in one of his memoirs titled The Iron Curtain. The unbelievable supplies of food, the restaurants, the movies, the wide open stores, the absolute freedom of the people, combined to create the impression of a dream from which I must surely awaken. The joy of experiencing freedom and comfort for the first time in one's life is a feeling that we who grew up in democratic societies cannot imagine. It must then have been an unimaginable terror when Gouzenko was called into Colonel Zabotin's office in September 1944 and told that he and his family were to return to the Soviet Union. As Gouzenko recalled, Zabotin told him, "For reasons unstated, the immediate recall of you and your family has been ordered by the director." Fear immediately overwhelmed Gouzenko, who could not begin to understand why his 3-year assignment in Ottawa was cut short to only 14 months. The only possible reason is that he was in some kind of trouble. Gouzenko had heard of what the regime does to disgraced intelligence officers, whose fate usually entailed harsh sentences in the gulags, torture, or execution, sometimes a combination of all three. GRU agents like Gouzenko have also previously been targeted by their rival agency, the NKVD. In 1939, the infamous Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, had a great number of intelligence agents recalled from abroad and executed in an act of vengeance against his predecessor, Nikolai Yezhov, one of the main instigators of the purges. However, unbeknownst to Gouzenko, it was actually a member of his own GRU who was after him. Colonel Mikhail Milshtin, who had met Gouzenko once at the recommendation of Colonel Zabotin, found Gouzenko suspicious, and he strongly objected to the fact that Gouzenko and his family were allowed to live in an apartment outside of the embassy amongst regular Canadian families. When Milshtin returned to Moscow, he reported Gouzenko to the GRU leadership, who then decided to recall Gouzenko. Colonel Zabotin, who was a veteran who fought at the Battle of Stalingrad, had a generous personality full of masculine bravado. Zabotin liked Gouzenko, and uncharacteristically for Soviet officers, he was willing to risk his neck for those under his command. Zabotin persuaded Moscow to postpone Gouzenko's return, citing that his position was too important to be left vacant, so Gouzenko could only be allowed to go back to Russia when his replacement arrived. Gouzenko was grateful, but he knew that this was only a temporary solution. If he were to return, not only would his life be in grave danger, but so would that of his wife and children. Gouzenko was not going to allow that to happen. That night, when he got home, he made up his mind to defect. From September 1944 onwards, Gouzenko set out to steal secret documents from the Soviet embassy and record the information of their agents and informants as a bargaining chip with the Canadian government. Gouzenko intended to reveal the active espionage operations the Soviet Union was engaging against an ally and the depth of their infiltration of the Canadian government, research institutions, and military. However, Gouzenko was not confident at all that the Canadians would take him seriously, considering that the Soviets were not gaining particularly valuable information from their operations in Canada, and the government of Mackenzie King was still focused on maintaining a good relationship with the Soviets. Gouzenko's concerns proved to be true. On September 6, the day after Gouzenko's unsuccessful attempt to approach the Ottawa Journal for help, he waited 2 hours at the office of Justice Minister Louis Saint Laurent, only to be turned away. Gouzenko was understandably distressed by this, and so was his wife Anna, who at this time was pregnant with their second child. Gouzenko even threatened to kill himself if his family was not given protection. They tried pleading their case at the office of the Ottawa Journal a second time, but once again to no avail. After that, the couple tried the office of the Crown Attorney, where they finally found someone receptive, a secretary named Fernand Coulson. Coulson first phoned an RCMP Mountie, who proved unhelpful, then the RCMP Assistant Chief for Intelligence, John Leopold, who finally agreed to see them the following morning on September 7th. That day, as time was rapidly running out and their impending doom was looming over them, members of the Soviet embassy began showing up at the Gouzenko's apartment, yelling and pounding on their door. Concerned neighbors called the police for help, but the police proved fairly useless. They were reluctant to interfere, claiming that the Gouzenko's apartment is Russian property. It was only when the mob of Soviet embassy personnel broke in and ransacked the entire apartment did the police interfere. While all this was happening, Igor Gouzenko, his wife Anna, and son Andrei had been hiding in the apartment of their next-door neighbor, peeping through the keyhole from across the hallway. No one was going to get a second of peaceful shut-eye that night. September 6 was also when Prime Minister Mackenzie King first heard of the events that were transpiring. He was informed by his close advisor Norman Robertson and his assistant Hume Rong that a Soviet cipher clerk was trying to defect, and there was possibly an enormous spy ring stemming from Canada to the US and UK. Surprisingly, the Prime Minister was not at all alarmed for the security of Canada and her allies. Instead, he had other concerns. In his diary he wrote, "I said to both Robertson and Rong that I thought we should be extremely careful in becoming a party to any course of action which will link the government of Canada up with this matter, in a matter which might cause Russia to feel that we had performed an unfriendly act. That, to seek to gather information in any underhanded way, would make clear that we did not trust the embassy. My own feeling is that the individual has incurred the displeasure of the embassy and is really seeking to shield himself." In essence, King did not buy Gouzenko's story at all. He was determined that his government was not going to get involved even if Gouzenko killed himself or if he and his family were captured by the Soviets. King was not going to do anything to damage relations with the Soviet Union, and his answer was final. Gouzenko and his family were not to be given asylum. Fortunately for Gouzenko, efforts were already taking place behind King's back to ensure the Soviets did not get their hands on him. You see, since September 4th, a day before Gouzenko's first attempt to have his story published by the Ottawa Journal, the RCMP had already been monitoring his activities secretly, without the Prime Minister's knowledge. On September 6, Charles Brevet Carnac, chief of the RCMP intelligence branch, met with Norman Robertson to discuss their course of action. That night, Robertson met with an unknown individual high up in British intelligence. It has long been assumed that this person was British Security Coordination Chief William Stevenson. However, as historian Amy Knight argued in her book titled How the Cold War Began, the Gouzenko Affair and the Hunt for Soviet Spies, Stevenson could not have been the one Robertson met on September 6, as King's diary that day shows that Stevenson was still in New York. It is more likely that this person was Peter Dwyer, the MI6 representative in Washington who worked under Stevenson. Although all this is speculation, yet to be confirmed, and possibly never will be. In any case, a person representing the British Secret Service had given Robertson enough reason to disregard King's wishes and order the RCMP to take Gouzenko into custody. After 2 interviews, the RCMP became convinced of the authenticity of Gouzenko's information, and they quickly alerted their British and American counterparts. The revelation of the extent of Soviet espionage sent shockwaves across all 3 countries and had tremendous consequences, chiefly among which was the start of the Red Scare. The list of spies Gouzenko exposed was long, but included British scientist Alan Nunn May, who was part of the Manhattan Project and was passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. May was arrested in 1946, blacklisted, and sentenced to 10 years hard labor. The discovery of May's secret allegiance to the Soviet Union also drove a wedge between British and American intelligence services, with the latter finding the former unreliable and untrustworthy. This damage to their relationship would take years to fully repair. Also implicated was Agatha Louisa Chapman, a British-born Canadian economist who worked for the Canadian Bureau of National Statistics, the precursor of Statistics Canada. Chapman was a pioneer for women in the financial sector and was also the great-granddaughter of Charles Tupper, a father of Confederation. Chapman was part of communist circles and was connected to Soviet sympathizers, but there was no evidence she ever became an informant. Although she was acquitted, she was ostracized from society and struggled to find employment. Chapman committed suicide by jumping to her death in 1963. Another person was Fred Rose, a Polish-born Canadian politician who was the Labour Progressive Member of Parliament for the electoral district of Cartier in Quebec. Rose had a long history with the Communist Party of Canada, and his name appeared in the documents Gouzenko provided. Allegedly, Fred Rose was the head of a Soviet spy cell with some 20 members, passing information to the Soviet Union about the production of the explosive material RDX. Rose was convicted and sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. After his release, Rose also struggled to find employment, as the RCMP kept him on close watch and constantly informed employers that Rose was a convicted spy. In 1953, Rose, now in financial trouble, left for Poland to set up a business venture and to seek medical treatment. While there, his Canadian citizenship was revoked, and his appeal attempts were rejected. Rose remained in Poland until his death in 1983. In total, the RCMP arrested 39 suspects, of whom 18 were convicted. In the United States, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the information revealed by Gouzenko to discredit left-leaning members of the Truman administration. It also led to the arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple who were convicted in 1951 for collecting information for the Soviets. This was a highly controversial case, largely because the evidence against Ethel was highly dubious. She was most likely convicted alongside her husband as leverage to make Julius talk. Regardless of what the truth was, both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 in the electric chair. Colonel Zabotin, Gouzenko's supervisor who protected him by demanding his return be postponed, was called back to the Soviet Union and sent to a gulag in Siberia. He was eventually released, but his career was over. In the aftermath of the Gouzenko affair, hopes for the continuation of friendship between East and West were thoroughly extinguished. The age of the Cold War had arrived, without question. But let us, for one brief moment, put aside the focus on geopolitics and return to Igor Gouzenko, the man. After the information about the documents Gouzenko provided went public, he and his family went into hiding somewhere in Ottawa. They were given Canadian citizenship and new identities, with Igor Gouzenko assuming the name George Brown. The Gouzenko family eventually moved to Port Credit, Mississauga, where they lived under constant RCMP protection. Still, for the rest of Igor and Anna's life, they will live in fear of Soviet retaliation. Igor Gouzenko died in Mississauga in 1982, and Anna in 2001. They were laid to rest beside each other in Mississauga's Spring Creek Cemetery. If you're thinking to yourself that Gouzenko and his family were lucky their defection worked out, you'd be correct. They were extremely fortunate to evade Soviet agents who chased after them, and to find people who were willing to listen to what they had to say. However, let us not forget that they also paid a dear price for their defection. Whatever dreams and aspirations Igor and Anna Gouzenko had when they were students were gone. They now had one goal and one goal only, and that was to stay hidden. In this sense, they didn't win their freedom, but at least their children will be able to enjoy it. But that's not nearly close to the worst price the Gouzenkos had to pay. Writing in his other memoir besides The Iron Curtain, titled This Was My Choice, Gouzenko discussed how he struggled to reconcile with the fact that his defection likely meant the death of his mother. While he did not know for certain at the time, Gouzenko's concerns were correct. His mother, who worked hard to raise Gouzenko as a single parent, was interrogated until her death at an NKVD prison in Lubyanka. Anna's parents and sister all received prison sentences, and her sister's daughter was forcibly sent to an orphanage. Gouzenko recounted a conversation he had after his defection, in which someone said to him, "Igor, you are a courageous man, but you must be an extraordinarily callous one as well. You realize your action would almost certainly mean your mother's death, if she were still alive." To this, Gouzenko replied, "It must seem so to you, but you speak from the viewpoint of one born and raised in a free land. My decision was a harsh one, but believe me, it was the only way to break the vicious hostage cycle used by the Soviets to hold and muzzle those persons sent to foreign embassies. Parents, in particular, are forced to stay behind as unofficial hostages. Somebody had to break that cycle, and I made the sacrifice in hope that if I got away with it, others may be prompted to take the gamble, for the ultimate good of a new Russia." Indeed, this conversation sheds light on what every defector must come to terms with, like those escaping from North Korea today. To abandon one's loved ones behind to the mercy of an authoritarian state is an extremely difficult choice. Yet so many like Gouzenko have made that decision. This perhaps speaks volume about the oppressiveness of life in these countries, which is so unbearable and so against human nature that it pushes people to escape, regardless of the cost. Thus, while on one hand, the story of the Gouzenko affair is one about Cold War espionage and politics, on the other, it is also the story about what human beings are willing to go through to escape the reach of authoritarianism. What do you think about the aftermath of the Gouzenko affair? Do you think the Red Scare was justified or overblown? Let me know in the comments. As usual, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, as I'll be making more Cold War related videos. Your support is deeply appreciated. See you next time.